What is an odds ratio? Odds ratio, the simplest formula of odds ratio is odds that a case was exposed divided by odds that a control was exposed. Now, to elaborate over this formula, let's take the example of a case control study. We will have the example of a case control study. And first of all, what is a case control study? Case control study is in the example of observational study. As in the case control studies, we are not using any intervention. So the case control study is an observational study, and within the range of the observational studies, the case control study comes in under the classification of analytical studies, because in the case control studies we are comparing the two groups. The group 1 is of case and the group 2 we take the controls. Cases are with the disease while the controls are without the disease. So to understand the odds ratio with context of case control study, first of all we will make a contingency table, a 2 by 2 very simple contingency table. Here is case, here is control, here we keep the exposure, here we will write exposed, not exposed. What we will write here? We will write here A, B, C and D. And now what is the formula? Odds ratio. The formula is odds that a case was exposed divided by odds that a control was exposed. So we will calculate the odds ratio by this and this. This is AD divided by BC. So if the interpretations of odds ratio, if it is 1, which means exposure has no association, exposure has no association with the disease. If it is more than 1, there is a positive association. There is a positive association between exposure and disease. And if the value of odds ratio is less than 1, that means there is negative association between the exposure and the disease. More the odds ratio is away from the 1, there is strong association between the exposure and the disease. Now we will have an example. The simplest example is of smoking and lung cancer. So our cases will be those who have the lung cancer with a history of exposure, obviously with the history of smoking since many years, while in the same case, for the same cases we will have the controls. Controls will be disease free, but obviously controls will also have a history of smoking and controls without the history of smoking. So what is the odds ratio? Odds ratio is odds that a case was exposed divided by the odds that a control was exposed. It's just a relationship between an exposure and a disease. What we want to prove here in this example, that is there a strong association between the smoking and the lung cancer? So the cases will be those with the lung cancer, controls will be those without the lung cancer. Exposure of smoking will be present both in the cases, both in the controls, and also there will be cases and the controls who will have no history of smoking. So, what is case control study? Here we should also revise what is a case control study. Always remember, case control study is from disease to exposure, or we can also say it is from effect, or we can say outcome to exposure. Case control studies are retrospective. They are always retrospective. When we start a case control study, we start it from the disease. The people are already suffering from the lung cancer, and on the basis of the history and on the basis of the available clinical data, retrospectively we will try to make an association between the smoking and the lung cancer. It is from effect to exposure, it is from disease to exposure, it is in the retrospective way, and it's just an observational study. And analytical study, because we are comparing the two groups. In analytical studies we compare the two groups and we compare the association between the exposure and the disease. Odds ratio is calculated not only in the case control study, but also odds ratio can be calculated in the cohort studies. But just as odds ratio, there is also relative risk, but relative risk is only calculated in the cohort studies and RCTs. In case control studies, the relative ratio is not calculated. In case control studies, odds ratio is calculated.